Every sport has a partnership that simply feels permanent. Michael Jordan had the Chicago Bulls. Tom Brady had the New England Patriots. And in IndyCar, Scott Dixon had Chip Ganassi Racing. For more than 2 decades, those names became impossible to separate. If you saw the number 9 car, you expected one thing: consistency, championships, victory. Generation after generation of drivers came and went. Teams rose, teams disappeared. Rules changed, cars evolved. But one thing never seemed to change: Scott Dixon racing for Chip Ganassi. Until now. Today, that remarkable partnership is approaching its final chapter. Chip Ganassi Racing has confirmed that Scott Dixon will leave the team after the 2026 season. It marks the end of one of the longest and most successful relationships in American motorsport. But that's only the beginning of the story. Because as soon as the announcement became public, another question took over the IndyCar paddock. Where does Scott Dixon go next? Reports have linked him with a possible move to Aero McLaren, although no destination has been officially confirmed. If those reports prove true, the balance of power in IndyCar could change dramatically. But before we look toward the future, we need to understand why this partnership became legendary in the first place. Long before he became one of the greatest drivers in IndyCar history, Scott Dixon was simply a kid growing up in New Zealand. Unlike many American racers who grew up surrounded by oval tracks, Dixon's journey looked very different. His talent appeared early, very early. As he climbed through junior categories, one thing became obvious. He wasn't the loudest driver. He wasn't the most emotional. He simply found ways to win. Again and again and again. That's what separated Dixon from many of his rivals. He rarely looked spectacular. Instead, he made almost everything appear effortless. Saving fuel, managing tires, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity. His style wasn't flashy. It was efficient. And over time, efficiency became his greatest weapon. That calm approach eventually caught the attention of one of the biggest names in American motorsport, Chip Ganassi.
When Scott Dixon joined Chip Ganassi Racing in 2003, nobody knew they were watching the beginning of motorsport history. Driver changes happen all the time. Some last 1 season, some last 3. Very few survive an entire decade. 24 seasons? That's almost unheard of. The relationship worked because both sides shared the same philosophy. No unnecessary drama, no headlines, no distractions, just racing. While other teams constantly searched for the next superstar, Ganassi already had one. Year after year, the partnership delivered results. Championships, race wins, podiums, consistency that almost nobody else could match. Scott Dixon became more than just another driver. He became the identity of Chip Ganassi Racing. When fans thought about Ganassi, many immediately pictured Dixon. That's incredibly rare in modern motorsport. Most successful drivers eventually leave. Some chase bigger contracts. Others search for new challenges. Sometimes relationships simply run their course. But Dixon stayed, season after season, through regulation changes, through new teammates, through changing manufacturers, through championship battles that tested everyone involved. And because he stayed, the partnership became something bigger than statistics. It became part of IndyCar's identity itself.
If you ask IndyCar fans to describe Scott Dixon, you'll hear the same words repeated. Calm, calculated, professional, relentless. He's never been known as the loudest personality. He rarely creates controversy, He doesn't need dramatic interviews to stay in the spotlight. His reputation has always been built somewhere else, on the racetrack. That quiet confidence frustrated rivals for years, because even when things looked impossible, Scott Dixon somehow found a way back. A clever fuel strategy, a perfectly timed pit stop, an error-free final stint. Over hundreds of races, those small advantages became legendary. Fans even gave it a name: the Dixon effect. Whenever victory seemed out of reach, people learned never to count him out. That reputation wasn't built overnight. It took decades, thousands of laps, countless hours inside engineering meetings, endless testing, and unwavering trust between driver and team. Trust that's incredibly difficult to build and almost impossible to replace. Which is exactly why this announcement has surprised so many people. After 24 seasons, why walk away now? Was it simply time for a new challenge? Did both sides feel the partnership had reached its natural conclusion? Or is there something bigger happening behind the scenes? Those are the questions everyone is asking. And while many answers remain private, the rumors surrounding Dixon's future are already reshaping conversations across the IndyCar paddock. For years, people wondered how this partnership would eventually end. Would Scott Dixon retire wearing Chip Ganassi Racing colors? Would he announce one final season before walking away from the sport? Or would something completely unexpected happen? The answer arrived in the middle of the 2026 season. Chip Ganassi Racing officially confirmed that Scott Dixon will leave the organization at the end of the year. After 24 seasons together, the most successful partnership in modern IndyCar history is coming to an end. For many fans, it felt impossible, because some partnerships become so familiar that we stop imagining them ever changing. Scott Dixon wasn't just another driver on the Ganassi roster. He was the face of the team. He represented everything the organization stood for: professionalism, consistency, patience, winning. So naturally, one question echoed across the IndyCar community: why now? The answer isn't a single dramatic event. There was no public feud, no explosive interview, no heated disagreement played out in front of television cameras. Instead, everything about this decision appears to reflect the same professionalism that defined the partnership itself. Reports indicate Chip Ganassi Racing offered Dixon a multi-year extension that would have allowed him to finish his career with the team. Instead, Dixon chose a different direction. That decision alone tells us something important. This wasn't simply a contract expiring. It was a choice. And choices like this are rarely made overnight.
Athletes reach a fascinating point late in their careers. Some become comfortable. Others become curious. They begin asking themselves difficult questions. Can I still compete at the highest level? Is there another challenge waiting? Can I accomplish something nobody expects? For Scott Dixon, only he truly knows the answer. But from the outside, several possibilities begin to emerge. Perhaps he simply wanted one final chapter somewhere new. After 24 years, even the strongest relationships can reach a natural conclusion. Sometimes, a fresh environment reignites motivation. Sometimes, a legendary career deserves one final adventure. And sometimes, the greatest competitors simply refuse to stop challenging themselves. Think about that for a moment. Scott Dixon has nothing left to prove. His place among IndyCar's greatest drivers is already secure. His legacy doesn't depend on another championship. It doesn't depend on another race victory. It certainly doesn't depend on another contract. Which makes this decision even more intriguing. Because if you're no longer racing to prove people wrong, what exactly are you racing for? Perhaps the answer is legacy. Whenever a legendary driver leaves, the conversation immediately shifts to the team left behind. Replacing Scott Dixon isn't like replacing any ordinary driver. His experience alone is nearly impossible to duplicate. 24 seasons means more than race starts. It means thousands of hours working with engineers, thousands of setup decisions, countless strategy meetings, an understanding of the organization that no newcomer can instantly match. That knowledge disappears the moment he leaves. And replacing knowledge is often harder than replacing speed. There's also another challenge. Leadership. Inside every successful team, there are drivers who naturally become mentors. Drivers younger teammates watch closely. Drivers engineers trust. Drivers whose calm voice helps everyone make better decisions under pressure. For Chip Ganassi Racing, Scott Dixon has filled that role for years. Finding another fast driver is difficult. Finding another Scott Dixon? That's something else entirely. Every successful sports team eventually faces the same question. What happens after greatness leaves? Some organizations adapt immediately. Others spend years trying to replace someone who simply cannot be replaced. That's the challenge now facing Chip Ganassi Racing. The team isn't just losing a champion. It's losing part of its identity. No major driver announcement exists in isolation. The moment Scott Dixon's departure became official, attention immediately shifted elsewhere. Where will he race next? Several reports have linked Dixon with McLaren, though his next destination has not yet been officially announced. If that move becomes reality, it would instantly become one of the biggest driver moves IndyCar has seen in years. Not simply because of Scott Dixon's reputation, but because of what his experience could bring to another organization. Championship-winning knowledge, strategic excellence, technical feedback developed over decades, leadership inside the garage. Those qualities cannot be measured on a timing screen. But every championship team understands their value. For now, fans can only wait. The departure is official. The next destination remains the unanswered question. And until that answer arrives, every rumor, every interview, every paddock conversation will be examined more closely than ever. Because careers like Scott Dixon's don't change direction very often. And when they do, the entire sport pays attention. When people talk about greatness in motorsport, the first thing they usually mention is numbers, championships, race wins, pole positions, podiums, and Scott Dixon has plenty of those. But statistics only tell part of the story, because the greatest athletes aren't remembered simply for what they won. They're remembered for how they changed the sport around them. Scott Dixon never needed to be the loudest voice in the paddock. He rarely made headlines away from the racetrack. Instead, he earned something far more valuable: respect. Respect from teammates, respect from engineers, respect from competitors. Even drivers fighting against him often admitted the same thing. If Scott Dixon was behind you, the race wasn't over. And if he was ahead of you, catching him would rarely be easy. That reputation cannot be bought. It cannot be manufactured. It has to be earned. One race at a time, one season at a time, for more than 2 decades. Those 4 words may describe Scott Dixon better than any trophy ever could, because they explain why this partnership lasted so long. Chip Ganassi Racing never needed drama. Scott Dixon never needed attention. Together, they focused on one thing: winning. Every great sporting era eventually reaches its final chapter, not because success disappears, but because time keeps moving. The names change, the teams evolve, new stars emerge, old rivalries come to an end, and new ones begin. That's exactly where IndyCar finds itself today. For years, Scott Dixon and Chip Ganassi Racing represented stability. They were the benchmark, the standard everyone else tried to match. Now, that chapter closes, and another one begins. Whether Scott Dixon races elsewhere next season, or eventually decides to bring his remarkable career to an end, one fact remains unchanged: his legacy is already secure. Nothing that happens next can erase 24 years of excellence. For Chip Ganassi Racing, the challenge now is obvious. How do you replace someone who spent nearly a quarter of a century becoming part of your identity? History suggests you don't. You build something new. That's easier said than done. Replacing speed is difficult. Replacing experience is even harder. Replacing trust may be impossible. When historians look back on this era of IndyCar, they won't remember only the championships, or the victories, or the trophies. They'll remember a partnership that lasted through changing generations, changing regulations, changing rivals, and changing technology. 24 years. In modern professional sport, that's almost impossible. Every great story eventually reaches its final page. Not because the story failed, but because every story, no matter how successful, must eventually make room for the next one. For Scott Dixon, that next chapter has yet to be written. For Chip Ganassi Racing, a completely new era begins. And for IndyCar fans, one of the sport's defining partnerships is now part of history. The question now is who writes the next chapter. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the biggest stories in IndyCar, make sure to subscribe to Trackside today. This channel isn't just about race results. It's about the stories behind them, the rivalries, the strategy, the decisions, and the moments that shape the future of IndyCar. Thanks for watching. We'll see you trackside.